Hello everyone, and welcome to the talk on trap spaces of multi-valued networks, definition, computation, and applications. My name's Sam, and this is joint work with Van Jiang and Belait from the LIS Institute in Marseille, and Thomas here from Institute of Science and Technology in Austria. So first of all, let me give you a very brief context about what are multi-valued networks and logical programming in biology in general. So in systems biology, one of the primary goals is to sort of simplify and model the biological reality in a way that can be understood, for example, through a computer. So a logical model is often just a digital simplification of the biological reality. It consists of variables, which typically represent some genes or proteins or other biochemical species, some regulations, which describe how these species interact together. They are often monotonic, but this might not be always the case. And these species that then typically have some kind of update rule that describes how the value or the state of the species updates with respect to the variables that influence it. Now, the simplest, most basic case are Boolean models, where basically each of the variables is given just a true, false, or 0, 1 domain. And then the update rules are basically just Boolean functions or Boolean expressions on these variables, which describe how the variables evolve in time. And these are often incredibly useful, but at the same time, they also often sort of fail to capture the true multimodal nature of some biological interactions. So sometimes some interactions are truly Boolean. You can define a threshold beyond which the interaction is active, and you just need two states for that variable. But sometimes the variable can have multiple meaningful thresholds that influence how its downstream regulated species behave, or how the variable influences these species. And for that, we often talk about multi-valued models or multi-valued networks. In such networks, we have variables that can have multiple values, not just true or false. These are most typically integers, bounded integers, but of course this is not strictly necessary. We sometimes talk about this concept of automata networks, where the domain of each variable is basically a state of some automaton. But for simplicity, for now, let's assume that all of these variables are just integers. And for the update rules, we then typically look at either logical update rules or arithmetic update rules, where logical update rules sort of give us a more similar description to the previously mentioned Boolean approach, where we have a logical expression which describes how or when a certain value from the domain of the variable is achievable. Whereas for arithmetic update rules, we have actual arithmetic functions which describe how the variable evolves. But of course, these arithmetic functions still work in the bounded domain of that variable. And there may need to be some kind of normalization or other transformations applied to make this sort of reasonably work together. Now, for these kinds of networks, the most predominant approach, which is used to study them, is through Booleanization, where basically each of these variables is expanded such that, so let's say we have a variable with a domain of size 4, and such variable is then expanded into either 3 or 4, depending on the specific Booleanization process. So either 3 or 4 Boolean variables, and the update rules are also updated such that now these 3 or 4 new extra variables update in a way that encodes the original behavior of the multi-valued variable. And this approach is often very useful, but it is in some specific cases limited because it basically introduces spurious states into our system and spurious trajectories, which can produce unexpected behavior in the model. So it's not always suitable for everything. And of course, it adds the additional complexity of adding extra variables, the need to do the transformation and such. Now, with logical models, what we are most typically interested in is their long-term behavior. And for this, we need the concept of an attractor. Here, attractors are basically inclusion minimal sets of states that cannot be escaped. So here, for example, in this picture, the purple or pinkish states are attractors, and coincidentally here, each attractor is just a single state, but of course, the attractors can be larger sets. Now, one issue we can have with attractors is that they depend on how we define the semantics of our model. So for now, I have talked about update rules, but I haven't talked about how these update rules are applied. And there are two main things that we need to consider. First is that in the multi-valued network, we can apply these updates in a sort of unitary or general sense. In general sense, we simply update the value to the value returned by the update rule. Whereas in the unitary case, we can always update the value only by +1 or -1, even if the returned value is higher, because this sort of approximates better the biological reality. Although there are exceptions where this may not be the best approximations. For example, if the time scales are vastly different, or if the domain of the variable is not actually continuous, it's just some kind of arbitrary discrete set. And the other aspect of this update semantics is concurrency. So we don't typically know how many of the rules can be applied at the same time, or whether there are some rules that are only exclusively applied together, etc., etc. And depending on how we set this update concurrency, we can get very different attractors. So here in these two pictures, these are actually attractors for the so-called synchronous and asynchronous update of a specific Boolean model, in fact. And we can see that indeed one of those concurrency updates produces two attractors, whereas the other produces just one if we look at attractors reachable from the state 0, 0, 0. Now, one way of dealing with this issue is this emerging notion of trap spaces, where trap spaces are essentially hypercubes in the state space of the multivalued network. So for each variable, we assign a subset of its domain, and a subspace or a trap space is then just the Cartesian product of all these individual domains for each variable, so thus a hypercube. And what makes a space a trap space is that it cannot be escaped. There is no transition ever going out of that space, and that this property holds for any update concurrency. And it is shown that we actually need to check this only in the fully asynchronous case. So if there is no transition going out in the asynchronous case, there's no transition going out in any update concurrency. And so what does this mean is that these trap spaces are essentially universal regardless of update concurrency. So this problem we had that we didn't knew which variables update together, which variables update how often, etc., we now don't have this problem. And empirical evidence has shown that these minimal trap spaces, or and now sort of to replace the notion of attractors, we specifically focus on something called minimal trap spaces, which is similar to attractors, just inclusion minimal trap space. And empirical evidence shows that these indeed approximate attractors very well, regardless of concurrency. And there are even applications for other types of trap spaces, which are very important. For example, we often would like to know maximal trap spaces or maximal trap spaces within some specific subspace, because these are important when searching for either commitments to specific model phenotypes, or just in general when looking for control strategies and reprogramming the system. Because once we can get into a particular trap space, we are guaranteed to stay in it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a minimal trap space. We just need to get into a trap space that satisfies our desired properties. So in this paper, we sort of tried to first define trap spaces for multivalued networks, because so far this has been mostly a concept just in Boolean networks, and try to prove as many properties that were originally just defined for Boolean networks, also for these trap spaces in multivalued models. And the second thing that we try to achieve is to provide a method for computing these minimum or other trap spaces. To do this, we basically consider two forms of input models. One is SBML, which is a very well-known markup language for describing various types of biological models. And the second is BMA, or Biomodels Analyzer format, which is another tool very common in this area, which, as opposed to SBML, uses this arithmetic notion of rules to define these models. And for both of these formats, we sort of define a shared symbolic representation of the models based on binary decision diagrams. And we use this representation to basically unambiguously resolve default values for functions, remove duplicate conditions, normalize input-output, because for the arithmetic rules, you need to sort of always normalize the inputs to the domain of the output variable, etc. And also importantly, with this symbolic representation, where we can very easily generate either the true general update or the unitary update, where every variable changes just by +1 or -1. From this symbolic representation, we then generate a Petri net, actually, which could represent the behavior of the network either in the unitary or in the general update scheme. And for this Petri net, it holds that for each multi-valued variable, we expand this variable into as many places as is the size of this variable's domain. And each transition in this Petri net basically represents one sort of disjunctive condition that triggers a value update from certain value to another. Now, finally, this structure of the Petri net can be then encoded as an answer set program or answer set programming problem, which is then solvable through the solver called Klingo. There are other solvers that are optimized for this problem as well, but so far Klingo is the most popular and most well-known, so we focus on this. And the reason why this technique works is this result, which was previously known for Boolean networks, and here we extend it to multi-valued networks, where it can be shown that under this encoding, the concept of a Petri net siphon is basically equivalent to the concept of a trap space in a logical model. And there is this nice publication by Van Jiang, which basically describes how such Petri net is then encoded into an ASP program that can detect these siphons. And so the ASP solver then gives us these Petri net siphons, and we translate them back into the domain of the multi-valued network. Another interesting outcome of this approach is that we actually, for the first time, have a working implementation that can translate biomodel analyzer model files into SBML. So this sort of bridges another gap in the systems biology community. And all of this is implemented in a Python package called trapmvn, so you can try to play with it anytime you like. As I mentioned, it supports SBML qual as one of the inputs, or the biomodels analyzer format, and it can also check some basic properties of these SBML files, and it can be used to solve a wide range of problems, including these minimal, maximal trap spaces. There's also a specific algorithm just for fixed point detection, which I'm not going to go into here. And perhaps importantly, it has very minimal set of dependencies. You just need the Klingo solver for the ASP part, and Aeon, which is just also a Python package for the binary decision diagrams. Now, we tested our package on a collection of 26 non-trivial multivalued networks, which we collected from mostly from the GenSim model database, which are these SBML models, or directly from the biomodels analyzer. And I believe the largest models here were 200 plus variables. We also implemented a special reordering heuristic for the symbolic representation, which allows us to shrink the Petri net representation as much as possible, because this was sort of revealed to improve the performance of the ASP solver quite a bit. And what we sort of observed is that our tool is at least as good, or oftentimes much better than state-of-the-art tools that work with the Booleanized version of the model, and that wherever we can't really compare the tool, we are still at least first of all, working and obtaining results, even for these large models, and oftentimes even very, very fast. Finally, to sort of demonstrate the applicability of this on some real problem, we focus on a previous case study from 2019, which basically studied heterogeneity of MYC expression in tumor cells, where they basically study that often in tumors there are two types of cells, one having high MYC expression, one having low MYC expression, and those are not viable in isolation, but together they sort of can work together and survive. And the original study sort of models this through multiple model variants and tries to investigate possible interventions that can sort of break this balance and basically force the tumor to die. So basically, the model contains some kind of apoptosis and proliferation variables, and the goal is to maximize apoptosis and minimize proliferation. Eventually, we were able to basically use TRAP-MVN to replicate the findings of this previous case study. However, there were some caveats, and the first one is that basically for some of the values, we just discovered a completely different result compared to BMA, which, however, is to be expected because BMA uses an approximation method here, and they don't actually claim for it to be exact. So this is sort of good news that we can now do this exactly, and actually, BMA also has an exact method for this, but they mention in the paper that it is not fast enough to compute all these results in time. So yeah, that's kind of a good outcome that our method is actually fast enough. And the second thing that we need to observe is that while the previous case study sort of considered like an average attractor state, here we actually obtain exact bounds on the long-term behavior of the model, which is often quite wide. In fact, this interval 0 to 6, for example, is actually the whole domain of the apoptosis variable. So basically for this 0 to 6 interval, the apoptosis value can be absolutely anything in the long term. However, we also get intervals that are much more focused, and thus it actually kind of makes sense to look at the worst possible and the best possible outcome admitted by the model. We look at the worst possible outcome, the best possible outcome, so the models where the intervention basically improves apoptosis, decreases proliferation as much as possible, and we look at what's the difference between the worst case and the best case. And first of all, what we find is that at least half the perturbations actually admit some kind of uncertainty in their outcomes. So it very much makes sense to focus on this property of the model. And not only does the majority of the perturbations admit this kind of behavior, even for like very good perturbations that would probably be considered, we often have non-trivial variability. So for example, here you can see that on the x-axis, we have sort of like the average score of each perturbation, and on the y-axis, we have the admissible variability in that score. So here we can see that we have perturbations that have an average score of 8, but variability of 4. So this sort of suggests that the perturbation is potentially even better than these best perturbations that we found here with score 10. But also in the worst case, it could just be somewhere in the middle, around 4, and it's not actually that useful. Overall, to conclude, in this talk, we sort of explore the notion of trap spaces in multivalued logical models, and we try to demonstrate that the trap spaces are a good alternative to attractors in terms of understanding the long-term behavior of logical models because they don't depend on update concurrency. And we proposed a method for computing trap spaces using translations to Petri nets and to answer set programming. And we give a tool for this written in Python. We demonstrate that this tool is useful for computations on real-world models, and we extend an existing biological case study to sort of better understand what are the possible bounds of the problem and of the models in question. Thank you for watching and feel free to get in touch in case you have any questions.